Hello, everybody. My name is Bill Duane, and it's true, I am wearing a shirt with a collar. So people that know me, that normally it's a t-shirt and a hoodie. So we're going to be continuing along this idea of how do we take these ideals that we've heard about over the last 2 days and actually incorporate them in the day-to-day of the work. Dolores did a pretty amazing job talking about the way that this then incorporates itself into how we train managers. What I'm going to talk about is how do you actually build a community of practice and meditation in the workplace. So before we get going, I want to talk about briefly about why Google is interested in mindfulness. We think about the benefits in terms of two categories: benefits for the individual and also benefits for the team, the organization, and the community. Now, when we think about benefits for the individual, there are three things that we're trying to, three kinds of trainings that we're trying to teach people: self-awareness, self-regulation, and compassion. When you have those skills, you then have the ability and the capacity to respond instead of react. You know, before was mentioned the Viktor Frankl quote that says, "Isn't that moment between stimulus and response lies the potential for freedom?" And of course, you can extrapolate this to think, you know, instead of responding, instead of taking the bait of yelling or being defensive or responding to the stress response, how can I be wise in this situation? And of course, we care a lot about cognitive performance. Interestingly, compassion I find absolutely necessary for individual practice. Dr. Ari mentioned that sometimes insight practice can be uncomfortable. When I first started practicing, I became aware that I had an inner voice that was fairly vicious, fairly self-critical. And so there's the idea that we like insight. It's like turning on a light switch. But sometimes when you turn on the light switch, you're just like, can I turn that off, right? But you can't. Therefore, compassion absolutely necessary for your individual practice. And I put et cetera for all the other stuff that you've heard so far. We're also interested in that. But it's really important to think about practice as beyond just the benefits to the individual. So if you think about an organization, it's essentially a machine made out of people, right? And that machine can either produce work and results, or it can produce the human equivalent of heat and light, politics and arguments and backstabbing. So what we find is that if people have these skills of emotional intelligence, your machine has less friction, and therefore there's more work and energy and heart available to get more things done. Secondly is also what Roshi Joan was talking about, looking at this bigger picture, the systems thinking, to think not only what's going on within the confines of my project, but what are the secondary and tertiary effects that are going on. And then to do that all with empathy. And we find that empathy is absolutely necessary for the sort of product design and innovation. So not only do you get a better product, but there's also the idea that you can make decisions that are wiser, especially for some of the non-obvious consequences. And then another nod to Meng is this, to me, if you have large amounts of people with self-awareness, self-regulation, and compassion, to me, that's my definition of the conditions for world peace. So great, mindfulness, right? So does everyone believe this from everything they've seen over the last 2 days? Can we get some applause for how excited we are about that mindfulness works? Oh, shit. It only works if you do it. Reading a book about mindfulness doesn't heal you. Going to conventions doesn't necessarily heal you, although I'm so grateful for the amount of practice that's been incorporated into this, right? So think of it as you have to do the practice. The research shows that the benefits of mindfulness correlate fairly directly with the amount of time that you spend practicing. So I'm going to tell you about some recent research that we did within Google that explores both of these areas, and then tell you about what we've done to address that. So we did a recent internal Google study in 3 locations, and we found that those that persisted in practice showed increased well-being, increased focus, and lowered stress. And some of this, upon statistical analysis, some of the factors that mediate those outcomes are increased attention, cognitive flexibility, and self-awareness. So again, we have shown what the external research shows is that mindfulness works. But notice that I skipped over the first sentence, right? Although engagement fell throughout the study, those that persisted saw the benefits, right? So a quick check-in with the audience. Who here has the meditation practice they want to have? Okay, good. Roshi Joan, well done. Most of us, most of us struggle with this, myself included, right? There's this, practice is difficult. It's radically counterintuitive in the workplace. Hey, you want to get more stuff done? Go sit in the corner silently. Right? There's a part of you that even if you know that, even if you have prior experience, you have difficult with it. I mentioned that it can be emotionally uncomfortable. So we see this in the data. Anecdotally, when I talk with secular and people from wisdom traditions, of the people that intend to have a practice, what percentage actually do? The sort of consensus number is between 5 and 10%. And you can see the numbers that we have here are closer to 20%, which is much better. But still, what does this mean? When we put these two things together, what does it mean? To me, it means if we want to help people and change our world, we should focus on helping people practice, right? We have medicine that works that people struggle to do, right? So if you can imagine, if we took that fairly modest number of 5 or 10% of people who are practicing, who intend to, and turn that to 15 or 20, which still sounds pretty crappy, right? But even still, that would double the amount of people with the skills of self-awareness, self-regulation, and compassion in the world. What would the world be like if that were true, right? So if we know it works, but people are struggling, then within Google, we said we have all of these great programs, but we should actually be focusing on practice. What should we do? So the answer we came up is a program called GPAUSE, and I'll get back to that very pretty logo in a second. And we set about answering this question the same way that we do product design. And in terms of articulating the design goals, we knew that this had to be community-based. Every wisdom tradition in the world comes together in groups for mutual support and compassion and peer pressure in some ways. So it has to be community-based. The other thing is, I use the word focus on the user as if we were doing product design, but we've done tons of focus groups about why is it challenging for you to practice? What are various things that we could do that would make it easier, right? So the third part, and this is a really tricky one at Google because we're so research-based, we're so science and data-based, we're such nerds about it, right? Is even though we care about the outcomes and we care about the mechanism, it's clear that this has to be a way of being, right? This has to be something that you do. So one of the beautiful things about working in this area is the people who want to volunteer from within the organization. So we have lots of people from a marketing perspective who came and gave us advice on this. And when I told them the goals of the program, they said, Bill, it's not a program. It's a lifestyle brand. And right? In the language of marketers, they say lifestyle brand. To me, that means, but it's a way of being. And it really had this idea that we need to care about outcomes and measurements and then let it go and then go about the business of being. There's also a lot of mindfulness efforts at Google. There's, of course, Search Inside Yourself. There's MBSR. I wrote a class called Neural Self-Hacking, designed to trick engineers into taking a meditation class. And I guarantee you, since the start of this talk, 2 new people have started mindfulness programs at Google, right? But as I mentioned, like, it's so important to put the emphasis on practice as opposed to information giving. So we wanted to have this common community where all these efforts could open up, could sort of dump out into, where people could focus on practice. And then the last part, it has to concern itself with the greater good. Even within an organization necessarily exists in a greater context. And right now, that greater context is pretty problematic, right? Wealth inequality, pollution, global warming, racism, political violence. There has to be a connection between what we're doing here and the outside world. Because, of course, the big trick is that we are the outside world and the outside world is us, right? The suffering and difficulty of prisoners, of people who don't have enough to eat, is the exact same difficulty in terms of how we react to that we have inside. So with that, this is the program that we've come up with. Now, a quick note is a phrase that you hear at Google a lot is launch and iterate, and we've been trying all sorts of stuff to say, how can we support practice? So right now, this is what the GPAUSE program looks like today. Group formal sittings, right, where people will come together for 20 minutes, some led, some silent. We have the Mindful Lunch program. One of the great benefits at Google is you have nutritious food that's offered free. And so there's groups set aside where people will eat silently as opposed to looking at their phones. Mindful movement. So important. You know, what was spoken about before was, during Roshi Jones' talk, about what's called interoceptive awareness. You know, people have a tendency to live from the neck up, and yet we know the body is a great source of data. So we've co-opted, is a not nice word for it, a lot of the yoga programs, and actually have introduced into this body awareness and for mindful movement. We also have 2-minute recording meeting meditations so that you can start off a meeting with a focus and then setting of intention. We also use the Headspace app. One of the key things, one of the key difficulties that we've worked with is people not having time. But if you have 5 minutes in your phone, you can practice. It's available to you, and people love it for that, right? We also have tons of talks. We had Matthew Ricard in last week. Sharon Salzberg is at a Google office seemingly every 4 or 5 weeks. She and I are sitting a retreat together and then going to teach in Seattle. So we really try and get both from wisdom traditions, lots of people in to inspire and ground in these much older traditions, and also, of course, a ton of scientists. We also have these things called detaching days, where we see that we put aside our labor and we put aside our devices and we spend a day in quiet contemplation together to give people a taste of the longer form practice. And then also important is volunteer service. This is mentoring, volunteer, and also financial support. I bribe Googlers. For every 20 minutes that you practice and record it, I give 50 cents to a nonprofit teaching mindfulness to less privileged groups, right? And it's this a way of connecting intrinsically our practice with this greater benefit in the world. We couldn't have GPAWS without this idea of service. So I'd like to share with you some of the success that we've had. Within a little bit more than a year, GPAWS is in 38 locations. 38 locations within Google. Every day, some sort of practice is going on. And let me talk about the most important part, is the volunteer leads. This is not a story about me or my team. This is a story about a vision that was put forth and then taken up by a large number of people. These are the people that show up every day. These are the people that ring the bell. These are the people that coordinate rooms and get programs in. So we've developed this beautiful cadre of more than 150 people who make sure and make the space available for practice. They're the heroes of this story. We also have this really well-recognized brand, that logo. That logo was created by Creative Labs, which is the top marketing and branding group within Google. These are the people that did the Apple Think Different campaign, and they're volunteering to come in and do beautiful logo and branding work for us. And when I see this sticker on laptops, this sticker means something. This sticker says, I practice. This sticker says, I care about compassion. I care about self-awareness. I care about self-regulation. I care about working intelligently. I care about people beyond Google. And I'm thrilled to see that. We've also raised $60,000 for groups that teach mindfulness to children in jails. As an American, that rolls off my tongue. For people not Americans, that may sound like an odd phrase, but we do have a lot of children in jail who can really benefit from mindfulness, as well as veterans with PTSD, and as well as teachers who are teaching mindfulness to their schools. So I realize that conferences are generally rah-rah and everything's awesome. I did also want to share some of the mistakes that we've made and some of the challenges that we have yet to solve. My practice is really formal sitting practice, preferably long-term, long retreats. So therefore, what's good for me is good for all of you, obviously, right? That's not true, right? We found out that for a lot of people, other forms of practice were really necessary. The other thing is, with the success of Search Inside Yourself, we have these constant waves of people who are new to practice and so enthusiastic and volunteering. And this is awesome, and we want to take advantage of it. And it's also really important to make sure that people of sufficient skill are actually doing the teaching. So we found ways to channel that interest and enthusiasm into areas where they can help support, and also make sure that we provide expertise so that people can get their skills and begin that process of multiple years of practice to the point where you can teach. By the way, mentioning teaching, in the introduction, it's important that I give a slight correction. I am not a Buddhist teacher. I'm a Buddhist teacher in training. It's a multi-year process of which I finished 2. So I didn't want to sort of take that authority. Some of the challenges still being solved is this initial wave of interest, and then as it goes down. This is a very natural process, and we see this in our products all the time. We're still figuring out what is it specifically we can do to catch people when their enthusiasm starts to wane, and then help support them. making time and priorities, everything is so important. This is probably going to be the work of my team for next year, is this idea of helping people create time and create space. And then the last is encouraging without being coercive. It's totally okay if meditation is not right for you, right? There's a lot of great reasons why people might not be ready, or it's just not the right time. And it's really important in an organization. There's not the idea that you have to do this. We really need to open doors and then be real with ourselves about not nudging people through it. So what's next? I'm really excited about the recent research, especially coming out of the Max Planck Institute, about compassion and altruism, adding much more of those active compassion and altruism practices. We're nerds, and we're going to measure all of this and look to see what works and what doesn't. Some of the research I showed we're going to be publishing externally. And then the part that I hope will be exciting for you is as soon as we figure out what works, we're going to give everything I just mentioned to you away. The slide decks with the research and the guided meditations and the mistakes to avoid and the recorded meditations. So I'd say probably I anticipate we'll get this right in about a year. So then we'll have GPAWS in a box. So with that, that's my talk. And thank you very much.